Right. Well, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us, Jonathan. Would you mind starting, as is tradition now, by telling us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, for sure. So my name's Jonathan Stringfield. I'm a vice president and global head of business marketing, measurement, and insights for Activision Blizzard across our media and esports businesses. So essentially, I oversee a global team of marketers, data scientists, and researchers that look at and seek to understand the unique power of gaming and esports, and gain additional insights about the folks that enjoy these pursuits.
So that's a prestigious position, and it actually covers quite a lot already. So when you say marketing, is it about engaging more audiences, or engaging further the audience that is interested in esports?
So I think where my focus is, and as you might suspect, as it pertains to a company like Activision Blizzard, there are multiple teams that engage in research. Some of them are consumer insights team, which are very inward facing, that really look to understand player behaviors and things of that nature to really optimize the experiences in that way. My team's focus is a little bit different, that we're a little bit more externally facing. And realistically, what we're focused on is the ecosystem of the businesses to which these types of experiences can live and optimally be fruitful. So less abstractly, what that means is we tend to work with the larger industry, principally marketers, advertisers, and what have you, for helping them understand the power of sponsorships or advertising or what have you, to essentially really make sure that that foundation of revenue is sustainable for the entirety of the industry, not just for businesses like Activision Blizzard, which obviously has looked at esports and what have you as not just a marketing ploy, but real businesses that we're seeking to sustain and create leagues that perpetuate for optimally hundreds of years, but also all the teams that have invested in this ecosystem, that invested in the games that we're putting out there, to make sure that, overall that ecosystem continues to be healthy. So what that means is it's a bit of a mix in terms of understanding players and esports viewers, and understanding viewer behaviors and how and why individuals play games or view games or what you, but really through a lens of where's their attention and where are ways in which we can make sure that, again, the baseline economics of these businesses remain healthy.
Oh, wow, you're touching on all the big pain points I think that there are in esports.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I wanted to immediately ask based on that is, esports seems to be almost like a sector, like a tech company, where we're throwing a lot of players into the mix, and there's certainly inflation and a lot of money coming into the sector, which and the buzzword, as I said earlier, is it doesn't sound sustainable, and that's what you're saying too.
If we look at it naively, or just kind of like at the buzz, a lot of young people, they're getting involved. Video games in general as an industry, that it's much more accessible, right? Like, you don't need to necessarily know how to program or create a game to get integrated into the video game industry. So you take all that, and what it has kind of created is a bit of a gold rush when you compound all the buzziness around it. So all fine and good. And again, we're excited about it. We're excited that there's a lot of momentum in this industry, and we believe in it and are investing heavily in it. But above and beyond that, we want to make sure that we're doing it in the right way. We want it to be done in a way that doesn't impugn on the core gameplay experiences. We want it to be done in a way that for the esports products we put out there, i.e. the streams and what have you, that these are quality products that folks are going to want to return to and continue to view. And we're doing it in a way where, again, much of esports as it stands now is indeed principally kind of built upon big game publishers putting these games out in the associated esports, with a few third-party leagues that have been around for quite some time also within that ecosystem. That we don't just want it to be the game publishers and a few select leagues. We want the teams to be able to participate. We want that overall ecosystem of the CPG sales and everything else that goes into it to really be coming to the forefront, because that is really what's going to create it to be sustainable. And candidly, why so much of in particular our strategy, and I think a number of others are following suit, we're really looking to craft esports leagues in the same way that quote unquote traditional sports have been brokered. Because one, it's something that's, I think, translatable to the overall marketing industry and business industry. But in addition to that, it's a good model to have a live entertainment experience that can be sustained with good, healthy economics.
I completely agree. And I want to see a lot more of that, because I think it feeds into the mentality that when you get an elite player, they don't appear out of nowhere. They've had often a long grind and going up the ranks. So more of these leagues, I think, will help better practices evolve and help bring out better players. But the obvious question that comes from that is, what has been one of the biggest hurdles to get through so far?
From my vantage point, in terms of making sure and doing the research around that industry ecosystem, candidly, it really all falls on education. That I think there has been, it's been described perhaps as a blind spot or some degree of kind of missing knowledge on the behest of, marketers and advertisers and what have you, that, they keep seeing the headlines, right, about, the growth of gaming as an industry, now increasingly both the growth of gaming and the growth of esports. And there's always kind of been like this nod towards, that's kind of interesting, but not a ton of engagement. So what needs to happen is that gap needs to get closed real quick, right? Because only when there is, I think, a solid knowledge of what the potential opportunity there is, again, particularly from an industry standpoint, who are the individuals that are within this ecosystem, what are their viewing behaviors and what have you, that's when we'll, I think, really be in a good place in terms of getting things like sponsorship dollars that really will essentially make it that much more sustainable. Because if you talk with anyone, brand managers at big CPG companies, if you talk to folks that work at advertising agencies, they have a very intimate knowledge of how consumers tend to interact with their phones or television or radio or any number of entertainment experiences, but candidly not gaming. So interestingly, a lot of the research that we do is, as is noted, like talking about, what the relative cognitive and psychological impact of advertising and sponsorship is kind of like a bread and butter, but also on, who gamers are and who esports viewers are and what the potential opportunity there is. Because, until we can get over that first hurdle, we're just not going to see the type of engagement that we'd like to see with the industry. Like we're getting a couple glancing blows because it's kind of buzzy and out there. But what we really need is that deeper level of engagement. That's really what we're working towards.
As you mentioned growth a few times, do you think in the next 2-3 years we'll be seeing more esports titles, or a bit more of what you've been mentioning about perhaps a higher focus on quality with what we have?
I mean, it could go any number of ways, which I know is something of a non-satisfying answer. But I think taking a step back, there's very broadly two paradigms to which, in particular, game publishers are looking at esports. And again, this is very high level. There's obviously a ton of nuance to it, but for the sake of argument, it essentially falls on the axis of companies that use esports or game publishers that use esports as a marketing tactic, and the companies or organizations that use esports to try to make them individualized business. So that's kind of where Activision Blizzard is, as noted. We're investing in so far as to make esports and our esports leagues as an independent product, but in other cases, it could just be a marketing tactic. So what that means is, will we see more potential titles that at least have an eye towards, having some sort of esports or at a minimum streamable, Twitch or YouTube gaming friendly component to it? Sure. On the other hand, will there be more concerted effort to bring those into being more core businesses? Possibly. But then the interesting thing is, returning to that point about grassroots, is that even with the best designs to try to make something a core esports product means nothing unless it gets picked up by the player base.
I think you've got, actually thinking about it, a very hard job, because for me, and what you've already said, is that one of the core defining features of an esport title is often quite a high learning curve. So then marketing logically seems like a tough sell now, because how on earth do you appeal to large numbers of gamers? What's the secret behind this?
I mean, it's tough. I mean, I won't go so far as to, go down the route of really trying to understand gamers from like a design and game standpoint, what have you. That's definitely outside of my scope. But what I can speak to is the translation of that to folks that aren't deeply within the industry, because candidly, that's what a lot of what my team does. And what we find is it's really finding the comparables for folks, right? So that, when in my day to day, and again, we spend a lot of time talking to CMOs and, ad agency executives and what have you. And, they've maybe gamed a little bit, or they'll have Candy Crush on their phone or something of that nature. And, maybe played, Super Mario Brothers when they were a kid, but, kind of haven't kept up with it. And, they kind of still have that viewpoint like, oh, it's for kids, it's kind of casual, etc. So you kind of got to telescope it back, right? And you kind of got to, start to paint this picture of like, okay, imagine you're watching a movie. Now imagine that movie, you're the hero, right? Because that's candidly the overall opportunity that games provide. And imagine how much more drawn into that movie experience you would be. And then you make that connection that, for people like myself, and, again, I am indeed, by every definition, a pretty hardcore gamer. This is everyday entertainment to me. So in the same way that, that ad executive might go home and, kick their feet up on the table and, put on, something on Netflix, I do the same, except I'm booting up my PS5 or my computer or what have you. So when you can start to make those connections, it starts to make sense. And then once you kind of get them over that hump, it is a little bit of a disentanglement in terms of like, what's the game versus the esport, and where do esports kind of come from a genesis of the game? And that gets a little bit more complicated, but it does kind of present an opportunity to walk them through the fact that like this is a rich and complicated ecosystem, and there are synergies even from, say, the core game. So like thinking about something like Overwatch versus the esports opportunity and product, which is the Overwatch League, wherein, as you might guess, folks that watch Overwatch League really tend to be Overwatch players. And that in and of itself is meaningful, because the more that you can understand about the Overwatch player base, the more that you can understand about the esport. And then that also starts to kind of like, I think, chip away at all the points that you noted that, again, some of these can be a little impenetrable for folks that are uninitiated. So it's certainly not the most straightforward path in the world, but as noted, why so much of our time and attention really is spent on education, because there's a lot there.
One thing that I was drawn to was, when do you decide if a game is marketable as opposed to should be left alone?
In there too, I think that'll probably fall more into, the game and product design area where I can't speak to as much. But I think it still kind of falls on that, where are we seeing the most attention, and candidly, where are we seeing the most pickup for an individual game? So like, something like Overwatch League, Call of Duty League, candidly, many of the competitive shooters feel like a natural place to kind of jump off, because they're competitive in nature. They are played online. There are rankings. Like, these are all things that, like, even at the most casual level, you're really kind of ramping up towards something that is, more akin to like a football match or basketball or something like that. But then you take something a little bit different like Hearthstone. So Hearthstone in and of itself, also a competitive game, but different from, say, a shooter. But it has elements of, say, somewhere between poker and chess. And no, I'm not trying to say that it's as complicated or not as poker or chess, but like, it's something that, really involves in strategy and randomness and whatnot. And that in and of itself also has a high degree of interest from folks that are into that in terms of like probability and what have you. So there too, there's a potentiality for a base. So, I think it comes down to the fact that like, certain types of games and environments that inherently have that competitive piece built into it, or can have a competitive piece built upon it, feel like the natural staging area. But then it really becomes, a question of, how much broad is the interest, and some of that is related to the overall size of the player base. But then also, what is the potentiality to kind of make that interesting from a spectator POV? And I think that can be highly differentiated from when you're talking about something like a competitive shooter versus, a card-based game versus, a MOBA.
And on a bit of a tangent, but what I've noticed in esports is we're getting more focus on aspects of the title that aren't related to the game. So what I mean by that is, suddenly characters in the game have a backstory, have lore. And even when you go to tournaments, it's not necessarily about the matches, but it's also about the players, getting to know them as well. So I guess it's a natural progression. Do you think that that's something we're likely to keep on seeing, essentially, when esports is a bit less about the game per se?
I mean, I think so. When it comes down to it, regardless of whether it's an esport or not, like, fundamentally, if you're going to become invested in a given form of entertainment or pursuit, there needs to be things to invest in, right? So obviously on the Blizzard side, particularly for games like Overwatch, and then think World of Warcraft and even Hearthstone, which is obviously an offshoot of that lore and universe. These are very deep in terms of lore. So if you're a fan, and again, as noted, I'm a fan of all the above, that makes it easy to get invested in, right? Because like understanding the stories and knowing the richness there, like there's really a lot to it. But then on the flip side, to your point about the players and what have you, something we think a lot about, and I think what, candidly, probably a lot of teams are thinking about is, really establishing star power, both for the teams, but also the players. Because, again, this is simplistic, but, ultimately true. Like, what we see is that viewers want to see matches that matter. And what that means is that, okay, there's high competitive stakes, but also that matters to the viewer, right? So whether that investment comes from, a deep understanding of the lore or an understanding of a given player and rivalries or what have you, any one of those can seem valid just so long as there is that degree of investment. So realistically, I think all of the above tend to really kind of funnel into a higher quality experience.
One thing that you mentioned a few times, which I really enjoyed hearing, was research. We're both really interested in this part of esports. Can you imagine game publishers like Activision, maybe not just speaking for them, but game publishers in general, organizing research projects on set goals that might involve academic groups? Or could it be something that needs more of a unified approach between publishers or not?
I think certainly a more unified approach could help, and I think there's certainly probably a willingness to do so, and work collaboratively across the publishers. Because speaking with colleagues at other game publishers and what have you that are in similar positions, whether they're on the research end or not, they too will very likely repeat some of the same thematics that I've talked about here, right? That, again, lots of nuance to it, et cetera. But when it boils down to it, education and insights. So on the one hand, we're already talking well into an area where the academic world, certainly has a high degree of value to bring. But then above and beyond that, when I talk about, what I do in specifically my role within Activision Blizzard, like, yes, it is speaking to principally marketers and agencies and what have you on behalf of Activision Blizzard and our franchise. But realistically, what I'm doing is just talking about gaming. Like, we're not to the point where I can really engage with them on a deep way about like what makes Activision Blizzard special and unique within the gaming world or the esports world or what have you. We're still getting over that first hump. So what that means is there's like a little bit of that, all ships rising kind of aspect to it, that so long as we, from whatever the source, and unified or not, and perhaps there's, I would say, a number of potential advantages for a more unified approach to overall educate the industry about gaming and esports and the opportunities therein, that inevitably helps everyone, right? And I think that feels like a really natural place for there to be that kind of intervention.
Yeah, thank you for that. I see game publishers often positioned as the puppet masters of the sector. And I think that really we need a lot more collaboration, because quite a few people really want to achieve a lot more in terms of research and understanding here. On that note, do you have any areas that you would really like more research in when it comes to esports?
I mean, I'd say kind of telescoping back from more of the nitty gritty that we focus on a day-to-day basis. This answer is going to be basic because, candidly, I think we're still kind of at the 101 level on our overall knowledge, right? So it's even going to be things like, what's the profile and motivation of an esports viewer? How is that similar or different from someone who consumes other types of entertainment principally? What other types of entertainment do they consume, and what are the relationships between that? What makes for a good experience within esports, either from the core viewership product, whether it's a stream or what have you, or from the game. Again, very building blocks type of stuff that, I won't go so far as to say there hasn't been any work done in that. Like, certainly there has been, but I still don't think we have enough. And I still don't think that, we have a kind of strong consolidated viewpoint on some of the bread and butter components of how do you and who are the types of folks that are highly engaged with these types of forms of entertainment, And, moreover, what are the potential synergies between the core gameplay products versus the esports products, which again, I believe there to be quite a bit there. And certainly, here too, we've done work internally, and I'm sure others have, but more understanding about that can only help.
I couldn't agree with you more. And on a related note, do you see a bit of a shift in how different people working at game publishers are seeing the concept of opening up their API, opening up their software to enable more research? It's obviously a very tricky situation, probably a lot of legalities involved, but have you seen a shift internally towards that kind of more collaborative approach?
I mean, as it pertains to esports, I think the advantage and disadvantage is that so much of it is, the core data to it isn't even really fully controlled by the publishers. It's really going through the YouTubes of the world and the Twitches of the world. So on the one hand, that does provide an avenue for potential access. And certainly, publishers, and inclusive Activision Blizzard, have our own channels through which, we put out these products. But realistically, so much of it goes through there. So it's almost, I don't want to go so far as to say it's kind of a moot point for me to comment on, because certainly I could have an opinion in terms of the extent to which that should be opened up or not, but realistically it does come down to those platforms and their capability or willingness to share out some of this data as well, which there are APIs to access things like YouTube and Twitch, and that's certainly a good start, and perhaps I think somewhat under leveraged as it stands now. But I think that's kind of the first step in terms of many. So from there, I think it does come to, a bit of a point towards, game design, and is something that's largely kind of more art than science, or a little bit of both in combination. And I think here too, the core game publishers themselves are also trying to be educated about, what the opportunities in esports are. So I think once some of that value becomes apparent, then I think that kind of leads to a potential willingness to potentially have more open partnerships.
My final question to you is, do you have any advice to people listening that find what you're doing incredibly interesting and would want to do exactly what you're doing? How do they get there?
I mean, I think there are a number of avenues, and I think certainly my background kind of goes from traditional academic research to more applied measurement research to the tech industry and what have you. But that is to say, in the broader sense, that there are a lot of potential opportunities within these types of ecosystems that, as these businesses and as the research organizations that are more directed to them grow and become more sophisticated, the surface area will also increase, right? So that's a long way of saying that I think, kind of like the old trope of, trying to work at tech companies, everyone thought that they need an engineering degree. And I can tell you, that having worked at Facebook and Twitter as a sociologist, that's, couldn't be further from, my background. It's more about how you apply yourself and the vantage point that you have and what skills you bring to bear on some of the core problems and questions that are present in these industries. So what that means is, like, to kind of distill one more step, is we need a lot of different perspectives, I think, in this industry. There's a lot of work to be done. Passion helps. I think understanding the space and being invested in it. And then it becomes a question of, kind of identifying where are there blind spots or in areas for improvement, and where you can fit into that. And I think, again, that could go from the publishers to, the esports teams and organizations that have coalesced to them, to indeed some of the academic endeavors that are starting to be more directed at the industry.
That's fantastic advice. And as a shameless plug, I definitely believe that winning an international award through an essay competition would be a fantastic way of putting yourself above head and shoulders of most people. Is there...
I can say from my vantage point, that is something that would jump out at me in a resume. So there you go.
Thank you. Is there anything you wanted to discuss at all, Jonathan?
No, I mean, I think we've covered a lot of it. I think, again, the opportunities there. I think the more that we can kind of move from the fog of war and the smoke of the buzz to really kind of understanding and being invested in growing these ecosystems, the better. So, candidly, I'm excited about the work that I have in front of me on behalf of Activision Blizzard to kind of make that real. And then, couldn't be more pleased to partner with organizations that are doing the same in a way that really kind of elevates the overall implied hard empirical knowledge we have around the industry, because again, it can only help to make sure that it's sustainable and something that continues to perpetuate.
Perfect ending. Thank you very much for your time, Jonathan.
Thank you. Had a lot of fun.